This video will explore some basic concepts related to behavioral ecology. And let's just begin by making the point that many behaviors in animals are both genetically based and environmentally based. So we can look at experiments done with rats making their way through mazes, nest building behavior in lovebirds, and even foraging behavior in fruit fly larvae to demonstrate the genetic and the learned components of various behaviors. There are, however, some behaviors that are strictly genetically based. They don't have to be learned at all. So, for example, there are a variety of behaviors referred to as fixed action patterns. These are behaviors that are innate. Again, animals don't have to learn these at all. They are just instinctively known within various animals. So just as one, there are many examples, but just as one example, there are these stickleback fish that we see in this image here. Essentially what happens is a male stickleback fish will build and defend a nest area, and so that if another male who would also happen to have this red coloration that we see here comes near his territory, he will take on a defensive, aggressive behavior and chase him away. And so what's interesting is that you can build models. These models can be made out of plastic. If you build a model that looks remarkably lifelike, but it lacks the red coloration, the male stickleback will completely ignore it. But if you build these other models that don't really look realistic at all, but yet they do have the red coloration, the male will instinctively try to defend his territory and chase these models away. So the point here is that it's this red coloration that triggers this fixed action pattern. And so once triggered, the fish automatically and instinctively tries to chase the so-called intruder away. If you think about fixed action patterns, you can think about this at two different levels. You can think about, okay, what is it that actually triggers the specific behavior response? And in a more broad sense, why might it happen? So this introduces these concepts referred to as proximate cause and ultimate causation. So proximate cause, this refers to what it is that triggers a specific behavior response. Ultimate causation, this addresses the basic question, why might it happen? So what is the adaptive significance of having this particular fixed action pattern? Just a few examples of ways in which animals are able to learn. So first of all, you see Conrad Lorenz here with a bunch of geese trailing behind him. These geese imprinted on him. So imprinting is an interesting situation where many animals, during just a very brief period, typically during the early parts of their lives, imprint. Typically, they're imprinting on their parents, but if the parents aren't around, they can imprint on whatever else happens to be nearby. In this case, it was a human being. Classical conditioning. This is an example of associative learning. So when animals learn to associate one stimulus with another. So for example, you might have heard of Pavlov's dogs. Essentially, he realized that he could ring a bell every time he fed his dogs. And the dogs learned to associate that bell ringing with being fed. So it got to the point where he could just ring the bell, dogs would automatically come, they'd start to salivate, and again, because they learned that ringing of the bell, that meant it's time to be fed. There are also many intriguing examples of demonstrations that animals can perhaps think. This, of course, is just a few, but here we see a crow in the upper left. Essentially, there's a piece of food hanging from a string. The crow learns to pull up the string in order to get the piece of food. Chimps can use pieces of grass to extract insects from the ground and eat them. Here we see an otter using a rock to break open a mussel or a clamshell. And down the bottom, we see a chimp figuring out how to solve this problem here. He can't reach the bananas, so he stacks the boxes up in order to reach the bananas and again solve his problem. And there are, of course, many other examples of animal thinking as well. What are some basic questions related to behavioral ecology that we'll address over the next few moments? Well, first of all, the basic question, what should an animal eat? Well, there's this so-called optimal foraging theory. In essence, what the optimal foraging theory says is that animals should optimize or maximize the amount of calories that they take in relative to the amount of calories that they expend trying to capture their food. So for example, if you think about these birds here, they can travel far away from the nest to try and capture food, or they can travel close to the nest to capture food. And the basic idea is that the farther away they travel to capture food, well, the more calories they should consume or bring back to the nest to make that trip worth their while. And essentially, that's illustrated in the results that we see in this graph here. So optimal foraging theory, again, just maximizing calorie intake versus calories expended to actually find and capture food. Who should you mate with? Well, mate choice, this is obviously many examples of factors that influence mating in different species of animals. Just as one example, take a look at barn swallows. Barn swallows have these very distinctive tail feathers, helps them in their acrobatic flights. Male barn swallows tend to have fairly long tail feathers. An experiment was done to address the question, well, how much, if at all, do the length of these tail feathers matter in mate choice? So an experiment was done as follows. Take some male barn swallows, snip off those outer tail feathers. In one group, you leave those tail feathers removed. Another group, you cut them off, but glue them back on. So another group, sort of as a control, you capture some birds and you handle them, but you don't actually cut off any of their tail feathers. And finally, this last group here, you add extensions to those tail feathers to make them longer than they typically should be. So you have these 4 different treatments, and then you observe these males out in nature and ask the question, how long does it take for each group of males to actually attract a mate? And interestingly enough, the results of that experiment are shown toward the bottom here. Those males with the longest tail feathers, well, those were the ones that found mates the fastest. So again, just illustrating as one example, ways in which people can actually study this mate choice in animals. Where should an animal live? Well, there's if just as one interesting example, let's briefly talk about those animals that migrate. So they might migrate long distances. You can think about monarch butterflies, salmon, birds, of course, often migrate long distances. How do they do it? How do they know where to go? Well, migration typically involves a variety of cues that allow animals to migrate long distances. So first of all, piloting. This refers to an animal's ability to use visual cues when it migrates. Another concept is that of orientation. This refers to the ability of many animals to detect direction. So they can sort of detect north, south, east, and west. So many animals can actually kind of put these two together, and they display true navigation. So it'd be like if I were to put you in a vehicle, blindfold you, drive around for several hours, then let you go, you could somehow figure out where you're at and how to get back home. Well, that's in essence what some animals can do through navigation. Just as one example to demonstrate this, take a look at this experiment that was done with some starlings that is illustrated in this map here. So the black arrows toward the top, this represents the normal migratory route of starlings. So they start up in this area, come to rest for a little bit in the Netherlands, and then they typically travel on their way toward Ireland and Great Britain, where they spend the winters. Now, an experiment was done where they captured some of these birds in the Netherlands, put them in a truck, transported them down to Switzerland, released them, and let them go, and then kept track of where they went. Well, interestingly, those birds that had made the trip before, they could somehow correct their flight pattern and get back to their normal wintering grounds. So they could navigate. They could truly navigate to get to where they needed to go. Those birds that had not made the trip before, illustrated by the blue arrows, well, they kept sort of flying in the same general direction that they were to begin with, but again, they had no clue or no ability to adjust their flight path. So this migratory route, there was a learned component of it. So only those birds that had made a trip before were able to correct their flight path and navigate to their proper wintering ground region. What are some ways that animals can communicate? Obviously, there are all sorts of ways and examples by which animals can communicate with each other. Just as a few brief examples, though, think about fireflies, mammals, birds. Fireflies, of course, they can use visual cues to communicate with each other. Mammals, they can use visual cues as well. We can use sound, we can use physical posture, right? All sorts of ways in which mammals communicate with each other. Birds, many birds are quite loud, so birds can use sound, and they also can use visual cues as well. And many birds can actually see color, and that's where the coloration of various feathers might come into play as being relevant. Just another concept that many animals can use to communicate is they communicate through pheromones. So pheromones are similar to hormones, but pheromones are actually produced and released outside of an organism's body, and they have an impact on some other organism. So many moths, for example, a female can release pheromones and attract males from very long distances away. Ants, they too can produce pheromones. So if an ant leaves a nest and goes out and finds food, comes back to the nest and leaves a trail of pheromones behind, so that other ants can follow that trail of pheromones and find their way to the food source. Bees, lots of studies done on bees. They can communicate a source of food to other members of the hive. So if a bee comes back to a hive and does the round dance, that communicates to others in the hive that there's food nearby. If it does a waggle dance, like we see illustrated here, that indicates that there's food nearby, and it gives a sense of what direction the other bees should fly to find the food. So if the bee vibrates its abdomen as it travels directly up, that indicates that to other bees they should fly directly toward the sun to find a source of food. If the bee vibrates on his way down, that indicates that bees should travel directly away from the sun and they'll find food. If it does it at an angle, again, that indicates the angle away from the sun that other bees should travel, again, in order to find food. Some animals are deceitful. They can trick animals of other species. So just as a couple examples, here we see an anglerfish luring another fish. So of course the anglerfish is going to eat this other fish here. Some fireflies can actually mimic the flashing patterns of other species of fireflies in order to attract an unsuspecting male who thinks he's going to fly in and find a mate, when in fact he finds a firefly of a different species and he ends up getting eaten. So of course, just a couple examples of deceitful communication in animals. One other question that animals have to contend with is when should they cooperate? Should they ever do a specific behavior where they might put themselves in harm's way or potentially even sacrifice themselves in order to help others? Well, this basic question relates to this issue of altruistic behavior. So altruistic behavior are those behaviors where animals essentially put themselves in harm's way, again, or even sacrifice themselves in order to help others. So this might seem like a paradox. You might say, well, why would these behaviors exist? They don't seem like that would be a wise thing to do, to sacrifice yourself to help somebody else. Well, just as a couple examples, bees can do this. Of course, they'll come out and sting an animal or a person who attacks their hive, and even though they're going to end up dying, prairie dogs will be willing to elicit an alarm call if a predator happens to come nearby, even though that means that whoever elicits that call is more likely to be eaten by the predator. So why would they do this? Why is it a benefit for some animals to display altruistic behaviors? Well, these next concepts, inclusive fitness and kin selection, essentially what these say is that there's more than one way for individuals to pass on their genes to future generations. So, for example, for you to pass on genes to future generations, you can have kids. Or your siblings, your brothers or sisters, they can have kids. They can have offspring because you share some of the genes in common with your siblings. And so the same basic notion holds true for all other animals. And the basic idea is that altruistic behaviors are likely to exist when animals can help closely related individuals. So if they can help closely related individuals, even though it might mean the death of themselves, that's one way in which they can help their genes be passed down to future generations. Along with this, you might come across this concept of coefficient of relatedness. And so, for example, you share half of the genes with your mom. So you'd say you and your mom share a coefficient of relatedness of 0.5, 50%. On average, you also share half of the genes with your siblings. So again, you would say you share a coefficient of relatedness of 0.5. That number, of course, would be lower if you compare yourself with, let's say, cousins. Right? So the idea is that the higher the coefficient of relatedness, the more likely an altruistic behavior is to take place. That concludes our brief introduction to behavioral ecology.